part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
For this episode, we decided to talk about the film Mudbound, which neither of us had seen before. We chose it because it was written and directed by a woman and had a female cinematographer. It certainly was a lot better than the last film we watched, Albert Nobbs.
A lot better.
So much better. But before we get into that, I thought it'd be a great idea for us to talk about what we've been watching, because I feel like it's been maybe 2 months since we've done this. So most recently, I have been watching the new season of Murdoch Mysteries, which I'm sure you will have remembered me talking about last year. Right when we were first starting out Petticoats and Poppies, the new season's airing weekly over on the Ovation app on Roku. So really enjoying catching up with that. It's a really good season. And it was like they shot part of it during quarantine. So it's one of those seasons. I also binged the whole first season of Shadow and Bone, which doesn't even come out until next month. And I can't talk about it, but I can't wait to talk about it because I think a lot of people are going to really love this show, including Nicole. And I mean, it has Ben Barnes in it. So, I mean,
so I'm in.
What can possibly go wrong? And then I also had to watch the whole 4 hours of Justice League because I got a screener for it. I thought I was going to have to watch Godzilla, but I didn't end up getting the screener for that. So, like...
Oh, congrats.
Crisis averted. And I'm also watching The Falcon and Winter Soldier every week. I do live streams over on the Geeky Waffle every Friday night, which by the time... you all lovely listeners hear this episode, Nicole will have just joined us to discuss this week's episode, so be sure to check that out over on YouTube.
Right. So obviously I'm also watching The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I have been a Bucky Barnes simp since the day he first arrived on the scene in Captain America, The First Avengers, which is still my favorite Marvel film.
It's so still my favorite too.
Yeah, I am. It's because it's a period drama. It's
Exactly.
a period drama masquerading as a superhero movie. But I'm loving Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and I will also say before I talk a little bit about what else I've been watching that I watched the second episode of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier the same night that I watched Mudbound. I watched them one after the other, and on one hand, like I was in pain, but on the other hand, it was actually really interesting how well they paired together, what a good combination they were, and that both of them really are about a pair of veterans, one white and one black, and what they face in America in terms of PTSD and racism. So it ended up being like a much more apt pairing than I could ever have expected. But I've also been doing some catching up on some Oscar-nominated films. Now that we have the nominations out, some ones that I would recommend, Another Round, which is a Danish film that snuck in a director nomination, which is really exciting, for Thomas Vinterberg. It has Mads Mikkelsen in it. He's really good. It really examines alcohol and drinking and sort of the culture around it and the kind of a really interesting look at addiction that I'd never seen anything like it before. It's on Hulu. Definitely recommend that. Also, finally watched Sound of Metal, which is on Amazon Prime. If you have Prime Video, you can watch it for free. Incredible movie. Incredible lead performance by Riz Ahmed. Really, I think, important representation as well for the deaf community. And the best sound work, I'm confident in saying, I've ever seen in a movie, or heard, I guess. I also have been catching up with the short films. I actually only have 1.5 of the ones that are like currently available to watch online left, so I'll be a little over halfway through all of the nominated ones, including The Letter Room, which you can buy on Vimeo. All the other ones that are available for free, but I was willing to buy this one because it's the one directed by Elvira Lind and
Yes, it is.
starred in by Oscar Isaac. It's a really interesting piece, actually. I think it's about a half hour long, and it has to do with a man played by Oscar Isaac who works in a prison as the person who essentially reads and censors the letters going in and out of the prison, hence why it's called The Letter Room. But it's a really interesting piece, and Oscar Isaac does some really good work in it, so definitely check that out if you're a fan of his.
I was so happy that got nominated.
Oh, I was so thrilled. I actually think it stands a decent chance to win, too, which is pretty exciting. And then I also watched The Courier with Benedict Cumberbatch, which I gotta say, I rag on that man all the time and his inability to do an American accent. But when he gets to just do his normal British thing, he's so good. He's so talented. The physical transformation in this movie is insane. Like, I actually didn't sort of believe it at first. I was like, is that makeup? Is that CGI? But no, it's him. And I'm so impressed with that movie. It's out in theaters now. I don't know when it comes to streaming, but if you are somewhere that you have theaters open and you are vaccinated and you feel comfortable doing so, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Otherwise, put it on your list to, keep an eye for whenever it comes onto streaming. Definitely recommend it. As someone who does not like Cold War movies and someone who's not super into spy stuff, I still absolutely loved it. So that's my ringing endorsement of that.
Can I just say, this award season has been so weird feeling. Like, I just voted this week for the SAG nominations. I actually nominated Riz because I thought Sound of Metal was fantastic. And I'm usually like really on top of things, but like I got a notice from SAG that was like 7 days until voting closed, and I was like, what? How could that be possible? Like, we just nominated people.
Season. It's such a weird season because it's off from the normal time in the year because they push the eligibility window, which I could talk for days about why they shouldn't have done that. But it does mean that, like, there's a part of me that, like, as someone who, is an Oscar blogger and podcaster, I feel like we have been in this freaking Oscar season for like 40 years. I can't believe we're not out of it until the end of April. I'm ready to move on to 2021 movies. Like The Courier, like, Raya and the Last Dragon. I'm ready to move on, but we got like another month left of this Oscar season.
It's so weird.
It really is. But to talk about a movie that was nominated for Oscars in its year, we're going to talk about Mudbound today, which is a 2017 Netflix film. I think it was one of the first Netflix films to really get a lot of hype as like an Oscar prospect, as a sort of a big deal film. It was directed by Dee Rees and written by her and Virgil Williams, and it's based on the 2008 novel by Hilary Jordan. So we love to see, a movie with a female writer based on a book by a female author. I actually was thinking maybe like I should check out this book because I like the movie that much. Mm-hmm. It starred Carey Mulligan, Garrett, is it Hedlund?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jason Clarke, Jason Mitchell, Jonathan Banks, Rob Morgan, and Mary J. Blige. It's about two families in Mississippi, one white and one black, and the two soldiers from those families that go to fight in World War II. We get a little bit of their story while they're abroad fighting in the war, and then really about the sort of experience of them coming back from the war, dealing with both PTSD and trauma from the war, and also with the racism that's incredibly prevalent in, obviously, 1940s Mississippi. It was nominated for 4 Oscars. Best Supporting Actress for Mary J. Blige, Best Original Song for the song Mighty River, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Cinematography. And Rachel Morrison was actually the first woman ever nominated for Best Cinematography, which is
insane.
Part of why we picked this movie, because we were looking for examples of women in jobs in film that you don't often see them in, and cinematography is definitely one of those. But also I found out Rees was the first Black woman nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay, which is
insane.
Crazy that didn't happen until 2017. And then Blige was actually apparently the first person to be nominated for an acting Oscar and a song Oscar in the same year, which is particularly interesting in that that has happened for the past 3 years. This year we've got Leslie Odom Jr., who's nominated for One Night in Miami and the song from it. Last year we had Cynthia Erivo for Harriet, and the year before that, Lady Gaga for A Star is Born. So I thought that that was interesting that we've seen that so much lately, but she was actually the first person for that to happen to. So, in terms of initial reactions, I think you've already, if you've been listening by now, you already know that both Maggie and I really liked this movie.
It was so good. And
we're really kind of surprised by how much. I am watching every Carey Mulligan movie this year. Why I said this is a thing I was going to do, I'm not really positive. But I was really excited to get to this movie. It was in the half of them that I'd not seen before. And I was really blown away by it. This cast is incredible. They're so well cast. The opening scene I found really jarring. Like, it really sets you up from the get-go. And I will say that I could imagine that this film, I mean, it's difficult to watch, like, for me as a white woman. Mm-hmm. So I can't imagine, like, I almost want to, like, trigger warning it.
Yeah.
For anyone who might be affected by the
subject matter,
the sort of racism that we see in this movie. Like, you know, that opening scene where they're digging a grave and they figure out that they've, you know, kind of struck into a slave grave, and they find the skull with, like, that obviously has, like, had a shot through it. Mm-hmm. And Jason Clarke, I don't think I've ever seen him in a movie where he played a likable character, but
he's just got an unlikable face.
He really does. I mean, he may be the nicest man in real life. I do not know, but the way that he plays his character, I think, is really effective. I actually love the narration in this. I know that was something that some people didn't like about the movie, but
I thought it worked so well.
And I love the fact that it trades around narrators, so we get a lot of different perspectives. And I think it is a really interesting way to adapt a book so that we still got a lot of the sort of internal monologue of different characters, especially because it is one of those movies where so many people aren't expressing what they're feeling, mm-hmm. that it's really nice to be able to get into their heads a little bit more.
And I think it worked especially well in the final scene.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also have to say, like, the audacity of that man, I think, is Jason Clarke's character named Henry? Yeah.
Yeah.
The audacity of that man to buy a farm and not tell his wife? Like, to roll up and be like, so I bought a farm, we're moving to a different state. Like, men have nothing but the audacity. I think this also is, like, a really interesting story, though, not just about these two men who go off to war and come back, but also about the families that they leave behind and the way that they end up supporting each other and the way that they sort of end up needing each other's help is really interesting. I think it's a really interesting exploration sort of all the different ways in which people are caged by society, whether that's racism or, you know, PTSD and mental health, or a loveless marriage and, like, the lack of opportunities for women. There's so much of this movie that really broke my heart, and also a lot that made me very uncomfortable. Like, everything to do with the racist grandfather, I was so uncomfortable. And obviously, like, that's a good thing. That's to the movie's credit. Obviously, there's also, I think anytime that you see, like, KKK robes and hats, it's pretty jarring. Like, even for me as a white woman.
Bone-chilling. It's
really difficult to see. But I do think that the way that the film is made, it doesn't ever feel, like, exploitative. I really also like the way that it portrays war as something destructive. It's not one of those World War II movies that, like, glamorizes war. But at the same time, it does sort of highlight the fact that war did present some unique opportunities for some people. And that's something I'll be talking about more later. I think that everyone in the cast is great. I'm so glad that Mary J. Blige was recognized, even if she's not my MVP of this cast. Garrett Hedlund and Jason Mitchell are definitely my MVPs. They're both fantastic. I also think Carey Mulligan gives a really good performance because, you know, she's Carey Mulligan. That's what she does. I also think that it's something that I've been, like, thinking about a lot, because I found this movie to be very moving and jarring and uncomfortable in all the right ways. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea that, and I guess this is also because for work I'm doing a project that has to do with the freedom rides, which were done not just by, Black people, but by white people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about the way that in this time period, especially, in these areas where racism was so prevalent, even if there were good white people, like we see with, some of these characters in this who aren't prejudiced, even they are constrained by the risk of the Klan and other white violence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those things where, like, it doesn't even matter if there are good people because the society in which they are in is so corrupt. And I just think that the way that the film shows that is really smart and really moving. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, I can't say enough good things about this movie. Obviously, it's not a perfect film. I think, there are a handful of moments where I think, like, the pacing's a little bit off, maybe. But I'm so impressed. And I really do urge, if anyone's listening to this and hasn't seen it, I really do urge you to go and see it. It's on Netflix. So, hop to it. It's also, like, a really nice length that doesn't overstay its welcome. Because I really think that it's a movie that speaks to not just our history, but also, unfortunately, where we are today.
I agree. This movie was just so damn good. I don't know what I expected, because I vaguely remember when it came out in 2017, and for some reason I just didn't watch it. So I didn't really know what we were getting into, but I ended up just being absolutely transfixed watching it. Could not take my eyes away from it. It was so good. And also, this is a period of history that I think is often overlooked, and when it is done, it's usually just focusing on the war and, like you said, glamorizing it. And I feel like the way that this was portrayed was just flawlessly done, and I was just so heartbroken the whole way through for these characters. I also really appreciated that everything looked so lived in and so dirty and so grungy and just very truthful to the hardships of life in Mississippi. And I really appreciate that. I think I talk about how I love a movie that feels lived in almost every time I talk about film. And so this had that aesthetic that I'm always looking for. And I feel like this was really a film that only a Black woman could bring to life the way that Dee did, just because of the subject matter and just because of the heart and the humanity that is being told. I think that there's nobody else that could have done this as well as she did. Also, can I just say, I think this is Garrett Hedlund's best role. Like, I'm still waiting for Nicole to watch Triple Frontier.
That's what he's in that I've been meaning to watch. Okay, that makes sense.
Like, you and I need to watch that, like, Netflix, like, party watch or whatever, because it's got Oscar Isaac, Pedro Pascal, Garrett Hedlund, Ben Affleck.
We need to watch that together. Yeah.
It's got all my men in it. But Garrett was just so good in this movie. He was acting his butt off, and I have loved him since he was in Aragon playing Murtaugh back in the day. And I'm still only slightly bitter that he did not send me an autograph when I wrote to him. I got that address. It said it was good. I'm still waiting, Garrett, if you hear this. But he absolutely acted his butt off, and it brought me so much joy to watch, even though it was like a tragedy to watch. And just the friendship that blossoms between Ronzel and Jamie was just so fascinating, because they both feel like so untethered from their lives, and they're both suffering through PTSD. And I liked how their encounters in the war paralleled each other, and their homecomings paralleled each other, and that they both ended up finding life away from Mississippi. I just like the narrative styling of those two stories where they merged and then separated. Speaking about Henry, I was really hoping that Henry would die when they were burying.
I wanted him dead so badly.
I was like, just do it, Jamie. I was like, you and Laura clearly have a connection.
Oh my God. Soulmates.
Kill Henry. throw him in the grave with your dad. No one's going to know the difference in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi. And then the two of you just go skirting off to Los Angeles. Like,
please.
So that's my ending of the film.
Yeah, in my mind, there's an epilogue.
There's an epilogue, and both Jamie and Ronzel got to be with their ladies.
Yep.
But, you know, that whole, like you said, that whole clan scene, I was both expecting it and not expecting it, because the father was clearly so racist. I was like, he's got to be a clan member, because he's too much. And then the way he was in the shop, I was like, yeah, he's definitely feeling a little clan going on here. And I was like, I wonder if this movie will do it. And I checked the time to see how much time was left in the movie. And I was like, I don't know. I'm not feeling like they're going to go the clan route, because I felt like that would take more time. And then when it happened, and it was just so bad, and I was so afraid for Ronzel. I was like, they're going to kill him, and he's never going to get to see his kid. And I was heartbroken. And I was like, Jamie's going to live the rest of his life feeling like he let a comrade down. Like, I was stressing. And, you know, I really loved Jason Mitchell in this role. Like, absolutely loved Ronzel. It's very disappointing that there's a lot of controversy around him. And I hope that all that straightens out and we do get to see him in more projects in the future, because I think he was a really phenomenal actor.
I think that one of the things that this film highlights that not many movies about World War II do is the experience of Black soldiers, which is not something, honestly, I'd ever even given that much thought to, in that I don't think it ever came up in school whenever we were taught about World War II.
No.
So one of the things I wanted to highlight was sort of to talk about Black soldiers in World War II, because about 1.2 million Black men served for America during World War II. It made up about 6% of all enlisted men. And actually, though, over 2 million Black men registered for the draft. They, from the very beginning, faced racism and discrimination. A lot of them were sent to training bases in the South, where the local people treated them really poorly if they went off of base. A lot of them were treated very poorly by their white officers. They were often relegated to labor or service units and not allowed to be in actual combat. But they did eventually, especially as the war went on and there was more and more need for more soldiers, serve across all of the armed forces in segregated units. The Tuskegee Airmen is probably the most famous one, but the 761st Tank Battalion was also a quite distinguished group. They were the first Black division to face ground combat in Europe. In November of 1944, they liberated towns under Nazi control, and then they also took part in the Battle of the Bulge. I wanted to highlight a couple of Black soldiers specifically. Benjamin O. Davis Harris was the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen, and he went on to become the first African-American general in the Air Force, which I thought was interesting. The first African-American recipient of the Navy Cross was Navy Mess Attendant Doris Miller for his actions during Pearl Harbor, when essentially, even though he wasn't trained in it, he went and took up, I forget what the guns are called that are on ships, but and helped shoot down planes. You might have some knowledge of him from the movie Pearl Harbor, in which he is portrayed by Cuba Gooding Jr. In December of 1944, because of a lack of replacements for white companies, General Eisenhower actually did allow 2,000 Black servicemen to serve under the command of white lieutenants to replenish companies that were low on men. And while they all were, received good reports on how they served, they faced a lot of racism from the white men that they were fighting alongside. I also found out that about 4,000 women served in the Army's Women's Army Corps, though typically in low-level positions, but a small number of Black women were nurses. Mostly Black soldiers were actually kept totally separate from white soldiers. with everything from segregated parades to segregated blood banks in hospitals. They also faced a lot of racism in terms of lack of promotions, and there were a lot of Black men who volunteered or were drafted but actually never served because they were only able to be put into Black units. And I thought it was interesting. In February of 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the most widely read Black newspaper in the company, published this article about the Double V campaign, the Double Victory campaign, basically saying that Black Americans were not only fighting this war abroad, but also a war against discrimination and segregation at the same time. And I found out that 708 Black men were killed in combat during World War II. Obviously, that's maybe a lower number than you would expect because of the fact that they were mostly kept in these service and labor units. And a lot of the men who served didn't actually see combat. Yeah, it's all this stuff that, like, I don't remember ever learning any of this in school. I feel like most of the time I see a World War II movie, other than Pearl Harbor, it's not even brought up.
No, not at all. And I get to talk about another topic that isn't brought up nearly enough. Obviously, war-related PTSD is like a very broad topic to discuss. So this is definitely a very surface level recap on the topic. I have a number of friends who have served in the military who suffer from PTSD. And I think that it's, something that's very rarely talked about. It's still very taboo. And I think what's also not talked about is how PTSD doesn't just affect the person who experienced the trauma. It affects everyone around them as well. So post-World War II, the narrative was very upbeat, with the media always focusing on the thriving communities. Now that the strapping young men were home, they focused on their weddings and the births and all this happiness. You see this reflected in so many of the films from the 50s and the 60s. It was all about the homecoming, and it was nothing about the after. It was very taboo to talk about divorces and the marriages ripped apart by the trauma and the substance abuse that came in association with the trauma. They didn't want to talk about the men that were still in the hospitals with the severe trauma-related mental health problems. It was all about the happiness, the happy home, all of these new neighborhoods, and all of that was a facade. Men who had PTSD had the highest number of divorce rates during this period, and it's just something that's never talked about. PTSD wasn't even officially recognized by the U.S. government until 1980, following the horrors of Vietnam. In 1986, the first journal came out theorizing that PTSD had the same intergenerational trauma as victims of the Holocaust. They studied 5 different families of men who suffered from PTSD and found that the children that lived in their lives lived their entire lives trying to mitigate the danger of living in these families and felt as though they were constantly trying to win fights. Life was just a series of anticipations of and reactions to their father's moods, impulses, and obsessions. Some felt that their entire purpose on life was to become their father's protector, going so far as to even having nightmares about a war that they never fought in. And so many of these children reported having these nightmares about being on the battlefield, trying to save him from having to see the atrocities of war. And so it was something that it rippled and had an effect on everyone that was around these children's lives and around these men's lives. In a study about wartime veterans from 1940 to 1980, researchers found that the 10 most common symptoms were anxiety, depression, sleep problems, headache, irritability and anger, tremors and shaking, difficulty completing tasks, poor concentration, repeated fears, and avoidance of social contact. And the thing is, you don't ever get over PTSD. PTSD is with you for life. You can lessen the effects of it, but it's always going to be there. There's a lot of oral histories from soldiers in their late 70s, 80s, 90s discussing the fact that they still have nightmares, that they still vividly see the blood and the dismembered bodies. Some of them even said that they had lost, their own children, their wives, their partners, and they felt nothing when they died because they still had to live with the daily pain of a war that they had fought a lifetime ago, and that it had completely desensitized them. That there's so many of them talked about how they just felt like they existed, that they had no emotions, that they were just wallowing in like a darkness that they could never come out of. And the thing is that this sort of trauma has effects on people that we know today that are the grandchildren of children that were raised in these environments where mental health wasn't prioritized, that their fathers leaned into alcohol and substance abuse and physical violence, and the ramifications of war are still felt today by people who never had anything to do with it because of the unhealthy habits that were learned. And so it's very fascinating to read some of this information about this and to see how psychology is still studying this and seeing if there's a lot of, if some of the toxic masculinity that we see today comes from all of this like really unhealthy coping mechanisms that were adopted, and then the children tried to overcorrect that, and then they pass that on to their children today. So it's fascinating just how widespread one world incident can have on everyone. And in closing, there are only around 320,000 American World War II veterans still alive today, and that number was initially around 16 million.
I like that we both were like, and we'll end our sections with death. On the same page.
Yeah.
So that actually
transitions.
That transitions really well, though, because I want to talk a bit about specifically Black World War II veterans, who obviously were going through all of the PTSD and trauma that all of the other veterans were, but we're also dealing with a lot more on top of it all. So a lot of the Black soldiers thought that fighting in the war would help them gain better treatment back home when they returned, especially because a lot of Hitler's treatment of Jews had been based on and compared to the Jim Crow laws of the American South. But this didn't prove to be the case. Some Black troops were actually met by white mobs when they returned, and soldiers wearing their uniforms out in public often faced brutality. In an article that I read for the New York Times Magazine, Professor Charissa Threat from Chapman University said, "At the heart of it was a kind of nervousness and fear that many whites had that returning Black veterans would upset the racial status quo. They saw images of Black soldiers coming from abroad from places like Germany and England, where Black soldiers were intermingling with whites and had a lot more freedom. So essentially, a lot of white racist people got worried that Black people who had faced lesser degrees of racism abroad and had lived outside of societies with Jim Crow laws were going to try and demand that whenever they returned. And so their answer was to beat and in some cases kill them." A Black veteran named Isaac Woodward in February of 1946 was ordered off of a bus after an argument with the driver in Batesburg-Leesville, South Carolina. He was beaten by the local police so badly that he was permanently blinded. There were also several other occasions of Black veterans being seriously injured or killed, which eventually led to the National Emergency Committee Against Mob Violence being formed in 1946. The group, or a delegation from the group, met with Truman, and they actually almost got an anti-lynching law passed, but Southern Democrats shut it down.
Of course they did.
Right, because, of course. But I think it is interesting to note that Truman did see that it was a problem, and he really was trying to, get to the root of it and try to find a way to fix it, but had issues with Congress. Another way that they were facing discrimination, though, was in being denied their GI Bill benefits, part of which came from the fact that a lot of Black soldiers were given a blue discharge, which was commonly used to weed out gay men within the Army. It's neither an honorable nor a dishonorable discharge, but it was given disproportionately to African Americans. They received 22% of the blue discharges, despite only making up 6% of the armed forces. And it made it really difficult to get any GI Bill benefits or to get hired afterwards, because obviously a lot of civilians weren't really sure how to read that, because it's not an honorable discharge, but it's also not a dishonorable discharge. It was finally discontinued by Congress in 1947, but even after the blue discharge was disbanded, the men who had been given it still struggled to get their GI benefits. It wasn't until 1948 that President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which fully desegregated the American Armed Forces, but obviously the American Army wasn't actually integrating until the Korean War. So what's interesting, too, that I was reading about is that Black soldiers were actually part of the troops that occupied Germany post-war. And obviously there was racism within Germany. I mean, unsurprisingly, this is like in the wake of Nazi Germany. It's not a discrimination-free society, let's say that. But there weren't Jim Crow laws. And so for a lot of these soldiers who had come from the South, it was their first time really living in a society that didn't have these really restrictive laws put on them because of their race. And they're mostly served in labor and supply units, but that also meant that they had a lot of the goods to give to people that those people had been missing during the war. And also, I found this was very interesting, jazz music was banned by the Nazis because of it being, of a Black tradition. And that actually, resulted in the Germans being even more drawn to these Black soldiers, because they were like, these are the jazz music people, we can have that again, which I thought was very interesting. But basically all of this, because of what they were doing and everything, the Germans were actually, fairly welcoming to them. And a lot of them, these soldiers really dreaded returning to the US and dreaded being called back home. And I think it's interesting, the Russians during the Cold War were very quick to point out the fact that there were these segregated units in Germany, and that, the Black soldiers were segregated, and that America had this reputation as the land of the free. But how free were they really if this is how they treated people of different races within their own country? Which, sometimes Russia had a point. But many of these veterans actually went on to become a part of the civil rights movement. And about a third of the civil rights leaders were World War II veterans, and they joined the NAACP in huge numbers. So a lot of the civil rights people actually said that they essentially trained in the war to become the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. And I think, it's really, really crazy to think about the idea that Black soldiers went and served in the war in whatever capacity in the 40s, and then to think about all the things that occurred with the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and just to think about the experience of those men who had fought and risked their lives for America, only to come back and face all of that. And that's one of the things that we see in the movie, is the fact that Ronzel, while he's in Germany, ends up in a relationship with a white woman, which would never have flown in Mississippi, where he's from. That would,
Nope.
It presents a relationship. It presents an issue in the film, even though she's not there. So the fact that could even happen, I think, while he's abroad during the war is really interesting, and something, again, just one of those things that I don't think I'd ever seen depicted in a film before.
No, I can't think of any other films that touched on that topic. Well, now for some lighthearted fun. Costumes. So the costume designer was Michael T. Boyd. He previously worked with Reese on her Emmy-nominated film Bessie, which was over on, I believe, Starz. In some interviews I found, he discussed how oppressive the weather was in Louisiana and how they'd have to have multiple versions of everything because everyone was getting muddy and just absolutely drenched with sweat. I also found this really great quote that just pleased the costumer within me. Michael said, "Sometimes people think, okay, we're doing something in the 40s and 50s and the fashion has to match, but that's not always true. For certain segments of society, it's very much backdated when it comes to period fashion. The poorer you were, the more time warped you looked. In this film, you could even wear clothes from the 20s and it would look real. These people were so poor and lived at a time when they passed clothes down multi-generations, grandmother to mother, mother to daughter, a world away from where we are today." And as soon as I saw this, I was like, I have absolutely no complaints about this costume, like the costume work in the show, because that's something that always irks me about period films is so many people think that, okay, we're doing this film set in 1920. Let's look at everything that people were wearing in 1920 and the highest fashion, and that's what everyone's going to wear. No, people are going to still be wearing clothes from the 1900. And so it was really great to see that he understood this, especially with somewhere like Mississippi. You're going to have people who are still wearing clothes from a long time ago. And everything just worked perfectly. I really don't have a lot to say because the costumes were just so good. There was a couple things where he talked about because of how hot it is where they were filming in Louisiana and the way that the sun kind of makes everything have this like sepia feel to it, especially when you start caking everybody with mud and sweat and dirt. He worked to try to make sure that nothing felt too washed out by the environment. He still wanted there to be like little pops of color and to make sure that everybody stood out amongst this very like bland, muddy background. And I think that he achieved that really well with the pieces that he chose. And everything just looked perfectly in time period. So I have absolutely zero complaints about this film in terms of costuming. Boyd knew exactly what he was doing and he accurately represented it in this film. There was also some interviews where he was talking about that he had just got done working on another period piece that had to do with the military, and they had military experts on that set that would like measure uniforms within like 1/8 of an inch to ensure that costumes were correct, which is so true. That sounds like the military to a T. And so he talked about how he made sure that like the Black Panther uniforms and stuff and all of the military uniforms on this show were accurate, even though he had to make all of those himself to make replicas, because obviously there aren't a bunch sitting around somewhere for soldiers to wear. But that made me happy because so often you'll watch TV shows are more notorious for this than movies, but you'll see like a group of like background actors in military uniforms and like they outrank the lead actor. And they just like, or like there's two conflicting ranks, like their shoulder patches don't match their badges.
Oh my God.
Or like their pants are clearly not fit for them and like you see their socks. And so it really pleased me. And when I was telling my mom about the film and was telling her this quote, she was like, a man after my own heart, because that's something my mom is like so religious about when it comes to costuming. She can't stand it when people think that, you know, just because it's this year, that means everybody's wearing the high fashion of that year. Like, no, people aren't going to be wearing that fashion for another couple of years. I mean, look how even today with the internet the way it is, some trends take a long time to pick up. You don't suddenly go out and buy a whole new wardrobe and trash everything you wore. I'm currently wearing a sweatshirt I've owned since I was 12, like from Arrow.
Right, that's true. Like I still have like it is the 2020s and I still have clothing in my closet from the 2010s and even the like I think I bought the sweater in 2006. Right.
It's made it through the 2010s and now into the 2020s, and I'm still wearing it. Like, we don't just suddenly change our clothes. And so it was nice, especially with the setting of this film and the people that it's about, that made sense.
I love that. I also really like the fact that whenever we do get those sort of flashbacks of Laura, Carey Mulligan's character, the clothing in those scenes is very different than what we see in the rest of the movie.
Henry just brought her down.
Oh my God. Like, whatever the opposite of a glow up is, that's what he made her do. But I do think it works really well to sort of give this separation between her life before and her life after marrying him. Yeah, I think the costumes, they're not like really snazzy, eye-catching costumes, and they shouldn't be. They just fit the film really well, and they're very nicely done. Awesome. Well, now that we've shared a lot of depressing information, I would just like to reiterate, I really recommend this movie. It's on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, or if you haven't seen it in a while, would definitely recommend catching up with it, especially, if you're watching The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, because it's actually a very good pairing.
It's such a good pairing.
Well, thank you so much for listening to our 22nd episode of Petticoats and Poppies History Girls at the Movies.
We'd love to hear from you over on our social media and to hear what you think about Mudbound.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Earglue Media website, and over on Audible. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to leave us a rating over on Apple Podcast or over on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we'll be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you'd like to be featured.
We'll be back very soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe and healthy.
And get vaccinated. You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. A lot better.
So much better.